I hauled the last of my stuff out of the cardboard box and tossed it onto the dresser. The ancient piece of furniture gave a sad creak under the weight of my small pile of t-shirts. 3 boxes. That's all my life had amounted to when Mom and Dad packed me off to Grandma's old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. Sorry, not Grandma's anymore. Mine now, technically. Not that I'd asked for it. Fresh start, Dad had said. Like getting expelled from 3 high schools was something you could just erase with a change of scenery. You'll like Hollow Creek. It's quiet. Quiet was an understatement. The place was dead. Just a handful of buildings that passed for a town center and miles of woods and farmland stretching out in every direction. No friends, no decent internet, and no way to get back to Portland without begging for a 2-hour ride to the bus station. The dresser drawer stuck when I tried to open it. I yanked harder and it finally gave way with a grinding sound that reminded me of teeth. The whole house was like this, fighting me at every turn. I shoved my clothes inside without bothering to fold them. What was the point? Something felt off about this place from the moment I walked in. Not just the usual abandoned house stuff, though there was plenty of that, dust on every surface and cobwebs stretched across the ceiling corners. It went deeper. The temperature would drop suddenly in random spots. I'd walk from the living room to the kitchen and feel like I'd stepped into a freezer for 3 steps before it warmed up again. The doors were the worst. I'd close one and turn around to find it open again. At first I thought it was just warped wood or bad hinges, but it happened too often. And the smell, old roses mixed with something else I couldn't place. Something metallic like pennies. Blood, maybe. That thought gave me a chill I couldn't shake. The first night wasn't too bad. I'd spent most of the day cleaning and setting up my room, and I crashed hard around 10. Woke up once to what sounded like the house settling. Creaks and pops in the walls. Normal old house stuff. I rolled over and went back to sleep. Night 2 was when things got weird. The noises weren't just random creaks anymore. They had a pattern. 3 sounds in a row. Pause. Then 3 more. Like footsteps, but not quite. I sat up in bed and listened, trying to figure out where they were coming from. The attic, maybe? Or the walls? It's just an old house, I said out loud, hoping the sound of my voice would make me feel less alone. It didn't. I told myself the house was just adjusting to having someone in it again. How long had it been empty after Grandma died? 6 months? The lawyer who handled her will didn't say much, just that she'd left the place to me specifically. Not to my parents, but to me. I barely knew her. We only visited a handful of times when I was a kid. By the 3rd day, I was starting to get used to the place. The weird temperature spots still bothered me, and I had to jam a chair under my bedroom doorknob to keep it closed, but I was making it work. I went to bed early that night, worn out from hauling the old push mower across the overgrown front yard. Something woke me up. My eyes snapped open in the darkness, and I knew immediately that something was wrong. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me. I turned my head to look at the digital alarm clock on the nightstand. 3:15 a.m. Then I heard it, a knock on my window. Not a branch scraping against the glass or a bird hitting it by accident. A deliberate knock. Tap, 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 tap. 3 slow, measured knocks with perfect timing between them. My whole body went stiff. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor. There was no porch roof outside, no way for anyone to reach that window without a ladder. Tap, tap, tap. The sound came again, exactly the same. 3 perfect knocks. I sat up, my t-shirt sticking to my back with sweat despite the cool night air. My room was pitch black except for the red numbers on the clock. The knocking had to be a branch from the old oak tree. That was the only explanation that made sense. Tap, tap, tap. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was ice cold under my bare feet. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept toward the window. The curtains were drawn, thick, musty things that Grandma had hung years ago. I reached out, my hand shaking, and grabbed the edge of the fabric. One quick movement, and I pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. Just darkness and the silhouette of the oak tree against the night sky. The branches weren't anywhere near the window, not even close. I pressed my face closer to the glass, trying to see if anyone could be standing on something below, but there was no ladder, no platform, nothing but a straight drop to the ground 15 feet below. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started. I stood frozen at the window for what felt like hours, searching the darkness for anything that could explain what I'd heard, but there was nothing. Eventually, I backed away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't lie down again. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those knocks in my head. Tap, tap, tap. By the time the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue, I was still sitting there watching the window. No more knocks came, but it didn't matter. I knew what I'd heard, and I knew it wasn't the house settling or a tree branch or my imagination. Someone or something had been knocking on my 2nd-story window at exactly 3:15 in the morning. And I had no idea what to do about it. I left the house as soon as the sun came up. After what happened with the knocking, there was no way I was falling back asleep, and I couldn't stand being inside those walls another minute. My phone showed 6:30 in the morning when I started walking down the long gravel driveway toward town. The air was cool and damp, heavy with morning mist that clung to the fields on either side of the road. My sneakers crunched on the loose stones as I walked, hands stuffed in my pockets, trying to come up with any logical explanation for what I'd heard last night. Maybe raccoons on the roof? Some kind of bird that made tapping sounds? I needed answers, and I wasn't going to find them sitting alone in that house. Hollow Creek wasn't much of a town, just a small cluster of buildings that included a post office, a hardware store that doubled as an auto parts supplier, and a grocery store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. A diner sat at the far end, its neon open sign glowing weakly in the morning light. I headed for the grocery store first, figuring I could at least grab some food while I was out. As I approached, I noticed an old man sweeping the front porch of a small white house across the street. He looked up as I passed, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took me in. "Morning," I called out, more to break the awkward staring than anything else. The old man leaned on his broom. "You're staying at the Warren place." It wasn't a question, so I just nodded. "Margaret's grandson?" he asked. "Yeah, Eli Warren." I stepped closer, crossing the narrow road. "Did you know my grandmother? Robert Johnson." He didn't offer his hand, just gave a slight nod. "Live right across from your place. Known Margaret 40 years. I hadn't noticed any houses near our property, but then again I hadn't explored much beyond the immediate yard. "Oh cool, maybe you can help me with something weird that happened last night." "Weird how?" Robert cut me off, his voice suddenly sharp. I hesitated, wondering why he seemed so tense. "Just some strange noises. Around 3 in the morning I heard this knocking on my bedroom window. The effect was immediate and disturbing. All the color drained from Robert's face. His knuckles went white where they gripped the broom handle, and for a second I thought the old man might actually fall over. "You don't want to be talking about that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "About what?" "It was just knocking. The knocker visits folks who disturb the land after midnight," he muttered, already backing away toward his front door. "Your grandmother knew better. She knew the rules." "Rules? What rules? What's the knocker?" But Robert was already retreating inside his house. "Ask at the diner," he said just before closing his door. "Catherine will tell you what you need to know." I stood there for a solid minute, staring at his closed door. What the hell was that about? I'd expected him to laugh at me, tell me it was probably a branch hitting the house or some local kids playing pranks. Not whatever that was. The grocery shopping could wait. I turned and headed straight for the diner at the end of the street. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in. The place was nearly empty, just a couple of old-timers at the counter and a family of 4 in a booth by the window. A middle-aged waitress with her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail was refilling coffee cups. She looked up when I entered and gave me a polite smile. "Sit anywhere you like, honey. I'll be right with you." I slid into a booth near the back and picked up a laminated menu. When she came over a few minutes later, coffee pot in hand, I ordered pancakes and bacon, then decided to test the waters. "I'm Eli Warren," I said. "Just moved into my grandmother's old farmhouse." The waitress paused, coffee pot hovering above my mug. "Margaret Warren's place, out on Old Mill Road." I nodded. "Yeah. Did you know her?" "Catherine Miller," she said, filling my cup. Everyone knew Margaret. Sweet woman, kept to herself mostly, but came in every Sunday for breakfast. She studied me for a moment. "You settling in okay out there?" Here was my opening. "Actually, I had a weird experience last night. Heard some knocking sounds on my bedroom window around 3:15 in the morning." The coffee pot slipped from Catherine's hand and shattered across the linoleum floor, sending hot coffee and glass shards in all directions. Everyone in the diner turned to stare. "Jesus." I jumped up to avoid the splash. "Are you okay?" Catherine didn't answer. She was staring at me with the same horrified expression Robert had worn, only more intense. Without warning, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and pulled me toward a corner booth at the very back of the diner, far from the other customers. "Sit," she ordered, her voice low and urgent. "Don't move." She hurried to clean up the broken glass, waving off help from another waitress. "It's fine, Betty. Just clumsy. I've got it." The other customers gradually returned to their conversations, though I noticed a few shooting curious glances my way. Catherine disappeared into the back for a few minutes, then returned with a rag and a mop. She cleaned up the mess with quick, efficient movements, then finally came back to my booth, sliding in across from me. "You listen to me," she whispered, leaning in close. "You do not talk about that in public. Not here. Not anywhere in this town." "About what?" "The knocking. Why is everyone freaking out about?" "Because it means it's chosen you," she hissed. "It's in your house now, watching you, testing you." "What's it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the chill running through me. "The knocker. That's what Robert Johnson called it." Catherine glanced around nervously, then reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she smoothed it on the table and slid it across to me. Your grandmother knew the rules. That's how she survived 40 years in that house. You need to follow them too every single night without fail. I looked down at the paper. Written in shaky handwriting were 6 numbered rules. 1. Do not look out windows after 3:15 a.m. 2. Never respond to knocking or whispers. 3. Keep all mirrors covered before midnight. 4. If you hear your name, ignore it. 5. Leave hallway lights on. 6. Do not move if the knocking stops suddenly. I read through the list twice, trying to make sense of it. This is crazy. What is this supposed to protect me from? Catherine leaned in even closer. It gets inside your head if you look at it or talk to it. Makes you want to go outside, into the woods. Those who break the rules, they come back different, not right in the head. Come back from where? What happens to them? I don't know, she admitted. No one knows. They just disappear for days, then we find them wandering the forest. They never talk about what happened, but they're never the same. She tapped the list with one finger. Follow the rules. Every night. Your grandmother did. But what is? No. Catherine cut me off, already sliding out of the booth. I've said too much. I won't talk about this anymore. She stood up, straightening her apron. Your breakfast will be out in a few minutes. The rules work. That's all you need to know. She walked away, effectively ending the conversation. When she brought my food a little later, she acted as if nothing had happened, chatting about the weather and asking if I needed more coffee, but she carefully avoided any mention of the house or the knocking or the rules she'd given me. I ate quickly, the pancakes turning to paste in my mouth. The paper with the rules sat next to my plate, and I couldn't stop staring at it. None of it made any sense. Cover mirrors? Leave lights on? Don't move if the knocking stops? It sounded like superstitious nonsense, but the fear in Catherine's eyes had been real, and Robert's too. Whatever they were afraid of, they truly believed it existed. I paid for my breakfast and stuffed the rules in my pocket. As I walked back through town toward the farmhouse, I tried to convince myself that this was just some local legend, a story they told to scare newcomers. The logical part of my brain insisted there had to be rational explanations for everything: the knocking, the temperature changes in the house, the doors that wouldn't stay closed. But another part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, kept remembering the sound of those 3 perfect knocks on my window. 3 slow, measured taps that couldn't possibly have been made by anything that should have been outside a second-story window. I trudged back to the farmhouse with the list of rules clutched in my hand, my mind spinning from what Catherine and Robert had told me about the knocker. The paper felt flimsy and ridiculous in my fingers, just a crumpled sheet with handwritten instructions that sounded like something from a ghost story. The sun was starting to sink by the time I reached the long dirt driveway. I looked up at the house, my house now, with new eyes. The peeling white paint and sagging porch suddenly seemed more sinister than merely neglected. As I walked up the steps, I tried pushing away the creeping feeling that the place was watching me. Inside, the house felt colder than when I'd left it that morning. I flicked on lights as I moved through the rooms, suddenly aware of just how many dark corners and shadowy spaces filled the old farmhouse. The rules Catherine had given me kept running through my head. Cover mirrors? Leave lights on? Don't look out windows after 3:15? None of it made any logical sense, but those knocks on my window hadn't made sense either. I pulled the crumpled paper from my pocket and read through the rules again. This is stupid, I said out loud, but my voice sounded small in the empty house. The old hallway mirror caught my eye as I passed a heavy antique thing with a tarnished silver frame that hung at the top of the stairs. My reflection looked tired and uncertain. I stared at it for a long moment, then glanced back at rule number 3, keep all mirrors covered before midnight. Seriously? I muttered. But even as I said it, I was already heading to the linen closet. I found an old bedsheet, yellowed with age but clean enough, and dragged a kitchen chair to the hallway. Standing on the chair, I draped the sheet over the mirror, tucking it behind the frame. The covered mirror looked like something from a haunted house movie, and I couldn't help but laugh at myself. This is what my life has come to. Covering mirrors because some waitress and an old man told me to. But I didn't take the sheet down. Instead, I went through the house checking for other mirrors. There was a small one in the downstairs bathroom and another in my bedroom. I covered both with hand towels, feeling more ridiculous with each one. After checking the rules again, I went through the house, turning on all the hallway lights. The bulb in the upstairs hall flickered ominously, making me wonder how old the wiring was in this place. The last thing I needed was an electrical fire on top of everything else. I heated up a can of soup for dinner and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, studying the rules between spoonfuls. The whole situation felt absurd, yet here I was, following instructions from people I barely knew because of some knocking I'd heard in the night. But what if they were right? What if there really was something out there? Something that had been watching my grandmother for 40 years. Something that was now watching me. By 10 o'clock, I'd convinced myself I was being paranoid, but I still double-checked that all the mirrors were covered and all the hallway lights were on before heading to bed. I placed the rules paper on my nightstand where I could see it, then set my phone to silent and plugged it in to charge. This is just for one night, I told myself as I settled under the covers, just to prove there's nothing to worry about. Despite my racing thoughts, exhaustion from the previous sleepless night pulled me under quickly. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, my body surrendering to the fatigue that had built up over the last few days. The knocking woke me instantly. My eyes snapped open in the darkness. The glowing numbers on my alarm clock read exactly 3:15 a.m. 3 measured taps sounded against my bedroom window. Tap, tap, tap. The same perfect rhythm as the night before. My heart hammered in my chest as I remembered the rules. Don't look out windows after 3:15 a.m. My eyes darted to the paper on my nightstand, barely visible in the dim light spilling in from the hallway. The knocking came again. 3 more perfect taps. Every cell in my body wanted to get up and look, to prove to myself that there was nothing there, that this was all just an elaborate prank or my imagination running wild. Instead, I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the blanket tighter around myself, trying to control my breathing. Tap, tap, tap. The sound continued, now slightly more insistent, a bit louder than before. I kept my eyes firmly closed, focusing on my breathing, trying to think about anything except the impossible knocking at my second-story window. Tap, tap, tap. For 10 minutes, the knocking continued, growing progressively more demanding with each set of 3 taps. The final set was so forceful I was surprised the glass didn't break. Then the knocking stopped, and for a brief moment, I felt relief wash over me. But the silence lasted only seconds before a new sound emerged, a whisper from somewhere inside my room. Eli. My blood turned to ice. The voice was soft but clear, coming from the corner near my closet. Eli Warren. The whisper sounded exactly like my own voice, as if a recording of me was being played back from the darkest corner of my bedroom. Every instinct screamed at me to respond, to call out and ask who was there. My mouth opened, the words forming on my tongue, but then I remembered rule number 4, if you hear your name, ignore it. I pressed my face into my pillow and bit down hard, fighting the overwhelming urge to answer the voice that kept calling my name. My own name in my own voice from inside my own room. Eli, we need to talk to you. Just answer us. The whispering continued, sometimes using my voice, sometimes shifting to tones and inflections I didn't recognize. Always my name, always asking me to respond. Then suddenly, everything went quiet. Not just the whispering, everything. The normal background noise of the house disappeared. The faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the occasional click of the old heater, the subtle creaking of the house, all of it gone, replaced by absolute silence. A cold realization washed over me. Rule number 6, do not move if the knocking stops suddenly. I lay completely still, my face half buried in my pillow, one arm awkwardly trapped under my body. I barely dared to breathe. The silence pressed against my eardrums like a physical force, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. Minutes passed. My trapped arm began to tingle with pins and needles, then go numb. My neck cramped from the awkward position. My bladder began to signal its fullness. But I didn't move. I couldn't move. The unnatural silence continued. Not a creak, not a hum, not a whisper of wind against the house. Nothing. Just perfect, absolute stillness. Hours crawled by. My muscles screamed in protest. The numbness in my arm transformed into actual pain. Sweat gathered on my forehead and back despite the cool air. But still I didn't move. I watched the numbers on my clock change with agonizing slowness. 4:12, 4:53, 5:37. When the first hint of gray dawn light crept through my curtains, I almost sobbed with relief. As the room gradually brightened from black to deep blue to pale gray, the normal sounds of the house began to return, slowly at first, then all at once. The refrigerator hummed back to life. The heater clicked on. The walls creaked as they expanded in the morning warmth. Only then, when the world outside my window was fully visible and the room was filled with pale morning light, did I finally allow myself to move. My muscles protested violently as I shifted position. My arm erupted in a cascade of pins and needles so intense that tears sprang to my eyes. I rolled onto my back, gasping, flexing my fingers as blood flow returned. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened during the night. The knocking, the whispers in my own voice, the unnatural silence. None of it made sense, and all of it had stopped when I followed the rules. A cold certainty settled in my stomach. Catherine and Robert had been telling the truth. Whatever the knocker was, it was real, and it was in my house. I forced myself to sit up, my muscles screaming from hours of enforced stillness. My right arm still tingled with pins and needles, and my neck felt like someone had replaced the muscles with rusted wire. After what I'd just experienced, there was no denying it anymore. The rules weren't superstitious nonsense. They had kept me alive through whatever had just happened. As I stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, I knew I needed answers. Real answers, not just cryptic warnings and handwritten rules. The locals clearly knew something about what was happening in this house, but they weren't telling me everything. My reflection in the now uncovered bathroom mirror looked haggard. Dark circles hung under my eyes, and my skin had a grayish tint that spoke of too little sleep and too much stress. I couldn't go on like this, trapped in this house with something that knocked on my windows and whispered my name in my own voice. After a quick shower that did little to ease my aching muscles, I found my grandmother's car keys hanging on a hook by the back door. I remembered the old Buick in the detached garage. I hadn't even checked if it ran since arriving. The garage door protested with a screech as I pulled it open. The car inside was covered with a thick layer of dust but looked otherwise intact. "Please work," I muttered, sliding into the driver's seat. To my surprise, the engine turned over after just 2 attempts. The gas gauge showed half a tank. My grandmother had apparently kept it maintained, even though Robert had mentioned she rarely left the property. I backed the car out carefully and headed down the long driveway toward town. Instead of turning into Hollow Creek, I continued straight on the main road. If I wanted real information, I'd need to look beyond this tiny hamlet where everyone seemed too terrified to speak openly. The next town over was Millfield. I'd seen signs for it when the bus dropped me off. It was bigger, with actual stoplights and a county library. The 20-minute drive gave me time to think. What was I even looking for? History of the property, local legends, information about my grandmother. All I knew was that something called the Knocker had targeted me, just as it had apparently targeted my grandmother for 40 years. And somehow she'd survived by following those 6 strange rules. Millfield was exactly what I'd expected, a small town that thought itself a city because it had a McDonald's and a hardware store with its own parking lot. I found the county library easily enough, a squat brick building with Millfield County Library spelled out in metal letters above the entrance. The air conditioning hit me like a wall as I stepped inside, a welcome relief from the growing heat outside. A few people browsed the shelves or sat at the computers, but the place was mostly empty. I approached the main desk, where an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun was typing with surprising speed on an ancient-looking computer. "Excuse me," I said. "I'm looking for information about a property in Hollow Creek." The woman looked up, her fingers pausing over the keyboard. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied me through wire-rimmed glasses. "What kind of information?" she asked. "Historical records, I guess. Newspaper articles. Anything about 1423 Old Mill Road." The effect was immediate. Her hands froze above the keyboard, and her back straightened. The friendly librarian expression vanished, replaced with something more guarded. "You're Margaret Warren's grandson," she said. Not a question. I stepped back slightly, surprised. "Yeah. How did you know?" "Grace Adams." She stood, smoothing her cardigan. "I knew your grandmother. Not well, but we corresponded occasionally when she needed research materials." She glanced around the library, then lowered her voice. "What exactly are you looking for?" I hesitated, wondering how much to share. But after the night I'd had, I was past caring about sounding crazy. I need to know about the house, about the knocking at night, about why everyone in Hollow Creek looks terrified when I mention it. Grace studied me for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "Follow me." She led me past the main desk and through a door marked staff only. We descended a narrow staircase into what appeared to be the library basement. The temperature dropped as we went lower, and the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed intermittently, casting strange shadows. The basement was filled with metal shelving units loaded with boxes and old books. Grace walked with purpose to a section at the far back, where a small table sat surrounded by filing cabinets. "We keep sensitive local records down here," she explained, pulling a key from her pocket and unlocking one of the cabinets. "Things that might upset tourists or new residents." I watched as she pulled out a thick file folder and placed it carefully on the table. When she opened it, I saw yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and what looked like police reports, all carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. "Sit," she said, pointing to a chair. I sat. "The property at 1423 Old Mill Road has a complicated history," Grace began, pulling out the first document, a newspaper clipping dated October 18, 1923. The first recorded incident involved the Holbrook family. She laid the clipping in front of me. The headline read, "Family of 4 vanishes from home." Beneath was a black and white photograph of a stern-looking man, a woman, and 2 children standing in front of what was unmistakably my grandmother's house. My house now, though it looked newer and was surrounded by farmland rather than encroaching forest. James and Martha Holbrook, along with their children Edward and Alice, disappeared on the night of October 15, 1923, Grace explained as I read. "The article doesn't tell the whole story. I've pieced together more from police reports and personal accounts." She pulled out another document, this one a typed police report. When neighbors hadn't seen the family for 3 days, they alerted the sheriff. When he entered the house, he found no signs of struggle or forced entry, but there were scratch marks on the inside of the bedroom windows. I looked up sharply. "Scratch marks?" Grace nodded. as if someone had tried to claw their way out, and every mirror in the house was shattered. My stomach clenched as I remembered Catherine's rule: keep all mirrors covered before midnight. What happened to them? I asked. They were found a week later, walking along the edge of the forest behind the property. All 4 of them, alive, but… Grace paused, searching for words. Changed. They wouldn't speak above a whisper. They refused to go indoors after dark. When questioned about what happened, they would only say, "It came knocking," and we answered. I felt cold despite the stuffiness of the basement. What does that mean? What came knocking? Grace ignored my question and pulled out another clipping, this one from 1937. After the Holbrooks were committed to Westfield Asylum, the house remained empty for years. Then the Peterson family bought it in 1937. This article was shorter. Local family missing, abandoned car found. Grace placed another document beside it, more police reports. Same pattern. They disappeared one night in March, found 5 days later in the woods. Scratch marks on the windows, broken mirrors, and they were changed, just like the Holbrooks. One by one, she showed me similar accounts spanning decades. Different families, different years, but always the same pattern. The scratch marks, the broken mirrors, the changed personalities. In 1954, a professor from the State University bought the property to study the phenomena, Grace continued, showing me a different kind of document, typed pages that looked like research notes. Dr. Alan Phillips. He was the first to document the knocking and the whispering. I skimmed the notes, my heart racing as I recognized exactly what I'd experienced. Knocking begins precisely at 3:15 a.m., 3 knocks in succession, voice calling my name, sometimes my own voice, sometimes others. Compelling urge to respond. What happened to him? I asked, though I could guess. Found wandering the woods after 6 days. Committed suicide 3 months later. Grace's voice was flat, but before that he wrote down what he learned. He's the one who first formulated the rules. She turned a page in the file, revealing a handwritten list that looked eerily similar to the one Catherine had given me in the diner. These rules, I said slowly. They work? Your grandmother is the proof, Grace replied. Margaret Warren bought the house in 1979 after the previous owners lasted only 2 weeks. Everyone thought she was crazy. The property was practically given away by then, no one would touch it. But she stayed for 40 years, I murmured. Because she followed the rules. Grace nodded. She was meticulous about it. Never broke them, not once. She told me once that she'd learned to live with it. That it was like having a dangerous animal in the house. If you know its habits and respect its territory, you can coexist. I thought about my grandmother, a woman I barely knew, living 4 decades with this thing knocking on her windows every night, never looking out after dark, never answering when it called her name, covering every mirror before midnight. What is it? I finally asked. This knocker. Grace closed the folder slowly. No one knows for certain. Local legend says it was once human, someone who got lost in the woods behind your property hundreds of years ago. They say it learned to mimic voices to lure rescuers, but eventually became something else entirely. That's just a story, I said. All legends have some truth, Grace replied. What we do know is that it's bound to that property. It can't leave the land, but it wants company. It wants people to join it wherever it exists. Those who break the rules, who look out windows after 3:15, who answer when it calls their name, who allow it to see its reflection. They're the ones who end up in the woods, and they come back changed, I said. Yes, but they're not really back at all, not completely. Grace's eyes were serious behind her glasses. Whatever part of them returns, the essential part stays in the woods. With it, she began gathering the documents, sliding them carefully back into the folder. You should consider selling the property, she said, not looking at me. Your grandmother was unique. She had an iron will, and even she, Grace trailed off. Even she what? The elderly librarian sighed. The last time I spoke with Margaret, about 2 months before she died, she told me it was getting worse, more persistent, louder. She said the rules were harder to follow because the compulsion to break them was getting stronger. I remembered the overwhelming urge I'd felt to answer when I heard my name being called, to look out the window when the knocking came. It had taken every ounce of willpower to resist. It's been getting stronger for years, Grace continued. Each person who breaks the rules and goes to the woods seems to feed it somehow, make it more powerful, more persuasive. You're telling me to leave, I said. Grace finally looked up at me. I'm telling you that what your grandmother endured for 40 years might be harder for you. The knocker is hungry, it's patient, and it has all the time in the world. As we climbed back up to the main floor, my mind raced with everything I'd learned. Grace walked me to the front door in silence. Just before I left, she placed a hand on my arm. Why did your parents send you to live there? She asked suddenly. Did they know about the house's history? I shrugged. I don't think so. My dad just said it was a fresh start after I got kicked out of my 3rd high school. I think they figured a quiet place in the middle of nowhere would keep me out of trouble. Grace's expression hardened slightly. So they didn't know what they were sending you into? Guess not. And you have nowhere else to go, she said, more a statement than a question. I didn't answer. We both knew the truth. My parents had made it clear that the farmhouse was my last chance. There was no going back to Portland, no other relatives willing to take in a problem child. If you're determined to stay, Grace said finally, follow the rules perfectly, every night, no exceptions. Your grandmother survived because she never, not once in 40 years, broke a single one. I nodded, thanked her for the information, and stepped back into the bright sunlight outside the library. The warmth felt good after the chill of the basement, but it did nothing to thaw the cold knot of dread that had formed in my stomach. As I drove back toward Hollow Creek and the farmhouse that was now my home, I tried to process everything I'd learned. The Holbrooks, the scratches on the windows, the broken mirrors, all those families who had answered when the knocker called, who had looked out when they should have stayed still, who had gone to the woods and come back changed. I had nowhere else to go. The farmhouse was my last chance, my only option, and now I knew what I had to do to survive there. Follow the rules. Perfectly. Every night. No exceptions. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I made the turn onto Old Mill Road, the farmhouse appearing in the distance like a sentinel against the darkening sky. I would do what my grandmother had done for 40 years. I would learn to live with the knocker, because I had no choice. I drove back to the farmhouse with Grace's warnings echoing in my head. Only my grandmother had survived by following the rules without exception for 40 years. The sun hung low in the sky as I pulled into the long driveway, casting long shadows across the overgrown yard. The old Buick rumbled to a stop and I sat staring at the house for several minutes before getting out. The two-story farmhouse looked so ordinary in the golden evening light. Hard to believe it harbored something that had driven people to madness for nearly a century. I have no choice, I said aloud, my voice sounding hollow in the empty car. I finally stepped out and walked to the porch, each footfall on the creaking steps feeling like a commitment. Inside, the house was quiet, that normal empty house kind of quiet that would have seemed peaceful a few days ago. Now I knew better. I threw my keys on the kitchen counter and unfolded the rules paper that Catherine had given me. After what I'd learned from Grace, these 6 simple guidelines felt like a lifeline, the only thing standing between me and whatever fate had claimed all those previous families. I had hours before sunset, but I wasn't taking any chances. Starting methodically from the top floor, I went through every room checking for mirrors. The bathroom mirror upstairs, the hall mirror I'd covered last night, a small decorative mirror in what must have been my grandmother's bedroom, a vanity mirror in the guest room. I covered each one with sheets or towels, securing them tightly so they couldn't slip. In the dining room, I found a china cabinet with a mirrored back panel. I emptied out the dishes and draped a bedsheet over the entire thing. The downstairs bathroom mirror got covered next. I even checked picture frames for reflective glass and turned them to face the wall. After an hour of searching, I was confident I'd covered every reflective surface in the house. Next came the lights. I tested every hallway light switch, replacing 2 burnt-out bulbs I found in a kitchen drawer. I considered the possibility of a power outage and dug through the basement until I found an old battery-powered lantern and some candles, which I placed strategically throughout the upstairs hallway. By the time the sun set, I'd checked and rechecked everything against the rules. All mirrors covered, all hallway lights on. I'd even taped black construction paper over the digital clock in my room so its glow wouldn't tempt me to look at the windows. For dinner, I heated a can of soup and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, too keyed up to sit down. I'd grabbed a gallon of water and some protein bars at a gas station on my way back from Millfield, which I now carried upstairs to my room. In my bedroom, I pushed my dresser against the door. Not to keep something out. Grace's research had made it clear the entity could move through the house at will, but to stop myself from sleepwalking or giving in to the compulsion to leave my room during the night, I gathered extra blankets from the linen closet and made a nest on my bed, surrounded by water bottles and snack bars. My phone charger was plugged in, and I downloaded some podcasts in case I needed distractions to keep me awake. This is ridiculous, I told myself, even as I wedged a chair under my doorknob for good measure. You're barricading yourself in because of ghost stories. But they weren't just stories. I'd heard the knocking, the whispers in my own voice. I'd felt that unnatural silence press against my eardrums like a physical force. I checked the time, 9:47 p.m., still hours to go before 3:15 a.m. I tried to distract myself with my phone, scrolling through social media feeds where friends from Portland posted about parties and school drama. Their normal teenage problems seemed so distant now, like they belonged to someone else's life. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke with a jolt to find my phone had slipped from my hand. The room was dark except for the glow from the hallway light seeping under my door. I checked the time, 1:24 a.m., still almost 2 hours before the knocker would come. I sat up and leaned against the headboard, determined to stay awake. I'd survived the last 2 nights by following the rules. I could do it again. The house settled around me with its usual creaks and groans. The refrigerator hummed downstairs. The heater clicked on. Normal sounds that now set me on edge, making me wonder if something else was moving through the rooms below. At 3 a.m. I was still wide awake, my back against the headboard, blankets pulled up to my chin despite the warmth of the room. My eyes burned from staring into the darkness, deliberately avoiding looking toward the window. Then, at exactly 3:15 a.m., it began. Not the 3 measured taps I'd come to expect, but a barrage of sound, dozens of impacts striking the house simultaneously. It sounded like a sudden hailstorm had descended, with sharp raps against every window, every door, every surface of the house. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the force of it. I pulled the blankets tighter, squeezing my eyes shut. This wasn't like before. The knocking was everywhere, as if 100 fists were pounding to be let in. Then came the voices. Eli. My name floated through the darkness, but this time it wasn't my voice. It was my mother's, soft and worried. Eli, honey, please, we need to talk to you. My eyes flew open in shock. That was impossible. My mother was hundreds of miles away in Portland. Son, just look out the window. We came all this way. My father's voice now, coming from near the closet. We're sorry, Eli. We made a mistake sending you here. I bit down on my lip hard enough to taste blood. It wasn't them. It couldn't be them. Eli Warren, an old woman's voice I barely recognized, had heard only on rare holiday phone calls. Grandson, please. I need to explain about the house. My grandmother's voice. But she was dead. Had been for months. More voices joined the chorus. Jared and Tyler, my friends from my last school in Portland. Miss Bentley, my English teacher who'd fought to keep me from being expelled. Even Robert from across the street and Catherine from the diner, all calling my name, all begging me to look outside to answer them. The knocking continued relentlessly, a chaotic percussion underlying the desperate pleas. Eli, we're freezing out here. Just one word, Eli, that's all we need. Look outside, you'll see us. We came to take you home, Eli. My hands clamped over my ears, but the voices came from inside my head as much as from the room around me. I rocked back and forth, repeating the rules silently like a mantra. Don't look out windows after 3:15 a.m. Never respond to knocking or whispers. If you hear your name, ignore it. The voices grew more desperate, more pleading. My mother crying now, my father's voice breaking with emotion, my friends laughing, then calling urgently. All of them seemed to press closer, as if they were in the room with me, just out of sight in the darkness. Eli, please, just one look. We need to see you, Eli. The door is right there, just open it. Come outside, Eli, just for a minute. The compulsion to answer, to look outside, was almost physical, like hooks in my skin pulling me toward the window. My body ached with the need to respond, to call back to the voices of people I loved and missed. I dug my fingers into the mattress, anchoring myself. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. 10 minutes, 15, half an hour. The knocking changed rhythm, becoming more erratic, more forceful. I heard wood splintering somewhere downstairs, glass cracking. The entire house seemed to shake under the assault. Eli, it's breaking in. You need to run. Get out now, Eli. It's coming up the stairs. My heart hammered, fear squeezing my chest like a vice. But I stayed put, eyes fixed on the shadowy ceiling, refusing to look toward the window or door. For 3 hours the assault continued. The voices cycled through everyone I knew, then moved on to voices I didn't recognize. Men, women, children, all calling my name with increasing desperation. The knocking never ceased, sometimes slowing to a rhythmic tap tap tap, sometimes accelerating into a frenzied pounding that made the windows rattle in their frames. Several times my resolve nearly broke. When I heard what sounded like my mother sobbing my name, I almost called back. When my best friend Jared's voice warned me that something was in the room with me, I almost looked toward the closet. Each time I caught myself at the last second, biting my tongue or digging my nails into my palms to break the compulsion. Then, sometime around 6 a.m., everything stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. The knocking, the voices, the creaking of the house, all of it vanished in an instant. That same unnatural silence from the previous night descended, but this time it felt different, heavier, more deliberate, as if the entire world was holding its breath. I remembered the rule. Do not move if the knocking stops suddenly. So I didn't. Not a finger, not an eyelid. I barely breathed, lungs burning with the effort of taking shallow, silent sips of air. The silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton wool, absolute and complete. 20 minutes passed according to my internal clock, though it felt like hours. Then, slowly, the normal sounds of the house returned. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the hot water pipes, the subtle creak of wooden beams expanding as they warmed in the morning light. I waited until pale gray light filtered through the edges of my curtains before I dared to move. My muscles screamed in protest as I uncurled from my rigid position, joints popping and tendons stretching painfully. I had survived another night. But something felt different this morning. The air in the house seemed lighter, the shadows less oppressive, as if a storm had passed, leaving clear skies in its wake. I waited until the sun was fully up before approaching the window. Drawing back the curtain, I looked out onto the front yard for the first time since before sunset. What I saw made my breath catch. The dirt around the perimeter of the house was deeply furrowed, with long continuous gouges as if something massive had circled the building all night. The trenches were at least 6 inches deep, cutting through the overgrown grass and into the soil beneath. They formed a complete circle around the entire house, like a boundary line that had been tested but not crossed. I stared at the markings for a long time, trying to make sense of what could have made them. No animal I knew of could create such perfect continuous furrows, and whatever had made them had been outside all night, circling, while voices called to me from inside my room. As I stood at the window, looking out at the damaged yard, a strange certainty settled over me. The knocker was gone. Not forever. It was still bound to this land, still waiting in the woods beyond the property line. But it was done with me. I had passed its test, just as my grandmother had done for 40 years before me. I can't explain how I knew this. It wasn't a voice or a message, just a bone-deep understanding that something had changed during the night. The farmhouse had accepted me as its new owner, and whatever haunted it had acknowledged my right to be here. I pushed the dresser away from my door and went downstairs. The house seemed different in the morning light, still old, still in need of repair, but somehow more mine than it had been before. I checked each room carefully, but found no damage despite the sounds I'd heard during the night. No broken windows, no splintered doors. The mirrors remained covered. The hallway lights still burned. In the kitchen, I made coffee in my grandmother's ancient percolator and took it outside onto the porch. The morning was cool but pleasant, the sun burning away the last wisps of fog from the surrounding fields. I sat on the top step, cradling the mug between my hands, and looked out at the gouged earth around my house. The rules had worked. I had endured what the previous families could not. Whatever the knocker was, whatever it wanted, it had tested me, and I had passed. For the first time since arriving in Hollow Creek, I felt like I might actually belong here. Not because I wanted to, I'd still rather be back in Portland with my friends, but because I'd earned the right to stay. I had faced what had driven others away, what had claimed parts of their souls and left them changed. I sipped my coffee and watched the sun climb higher in the sky. The farmhouse stood solid behind me, and for the first time it felt like shelter rather than a trap. My grandmother had survived here for 40 years by understanding the rules. Now I would do the same. The house was truly mine now,